Under the icy skies of the Ardennes, where every breath turned to frost, the Battle of the Bulge unfolded, a monumental clash that would echo through history, shaping the course of the Second World War. The Ardennes Forest, blanketed in a thick layer of snow, was eerily silent, save for the occasional distant rumble of artillery. The winter of 1944 had brought with it a biting cold that seeped into the bones of the men stationed there. Among them was Captain John Miller's platoon, a mosaic of faces from across the Allied nations, each marked by the weariness of war yet burning with a quiet resolve. Captain Miller, a tall man with a stern yet thoughtful demeanor, surveyed his troops as they prepared their positions. Despite the frigid air, there was an air of camaraderie that wove through the men, a shared sense of purpose that bound them together. Miller knew that morale was as crucial as ammunition in this war, and he did his best to keep spirits high. Lieutenant James Bennett, attached to Miller's unit from the British Army, approached with a map in hand. "Captain, recon suggests the Germans are miles away. They wouldn't dare an offensive in this weather," he said, his youthful face betraying a hint of naivety. Miller nodded, but his eyes, honed by experience, held a cautious glint. "The Germans have surprised us before, Lieutenant. We'll stay alert," he replied, his voice firm yet reassuring. Nearby, Sergeant Elijah Harris, a veteran who had seen more battles than he cared to count, shared a light moment with the younger soldiers. His laughter, deep and infectious, momentarily lifted the heaviness that hung over the camp. Among those soldiers was Private Thomas O'Reilly, a young man with bright eyes and a mop of curly hair, who hung on to every word of the sergeant. Just outside the makeshift medical tent, Corporal Anna Kowalski was busy organizing medical supplies. Her hands, though numb from the cold, moved with practiced efficiency. She caught the eye of Miller, offering him a brief, resilient smile. He nodded in respect. Her presence in the midst of such chaos was a beacon of strength for many. As the day waned, the men fortified their positions. Private Wilhelm Schmidt, a German-American whose loyalty had been questioned at first, worked diligently, his actions speaking louder than words ever could. Nearby, radio operator Samuel Greenberg huddled over his equipment, ensuring lines of communication remained open, his expression one of focused determination. The platoon was a microcosm of the Allied forces, diverse yet unified against a common enemy. As night fell, the men settled into their routines, the silence of the Ardennes enveloping them like a thick cloak. Captain Miller, his mind always on the task ahead, kept a watchful eye. He knew the tranquility could be shattered at any moment, but for now, his men had a chance to rest. In the distance, the occasional flicker of gunfire lit up the horizon, a stark reminder of the war that raged beyond their camp. Captain Miller gazed into the darkness, his thoughts a mix of strategy and concern for his men. They were trained and ready, but the unknowns of war always lingered like shadows at the edge of a fire's light. As the first chapter of their story in the Battle of the Bulge closed, the men of Miller's platoon hunkered down in their foxholes and tents, finding comfort in small acts of routine and the camaraderie they shared. The crackling of the radio and the muffled sounds of their surroundings were the only indications that they were not alone in the vast, frost-covered forest. Yet, even in the stillness of the night, there was an undercurrent of tension, a collective breath held in anticipation of what was to come. The men had heard rumors, whispers of a German counteroffensive. But for now, those were just shadows in the darkness, shapeless fears that had yet to take form. Private O'Reilly, tucked into his sleeping bag, clutched a worn photograph of his family back home. His thoughts drifted to them, to the world beyond the war, a world he desperately hoped to return to. Beside him, Sergeant Harris kept a silent vigil, his experienced eyes scanning the dark tree line, his mind alert to any sign of movement. In the command tent, Captain Miller and Lieutenant Bennett pored over maps and reports, plotting and planning, their minds racing through countless scenarios. The weight of responsibility lay heavy on Miller's shoulders, the lives of his men, a burden he bore with quiet dignity. As dawn approached, a sense of unease crept through the camp. The cold was relentless, seeping into every corner, every fiber, chilling not just their bodies but their spirits. Yet, as the first light of day broke over the forest, it brought with it a renewed sense of purpose. They were soldiers, defenders of freedom, and they would meet whatever came their way with the courage and determination that had brought them this far. The frosty Ardennes, with its snow-laden trees and icy winds, was more than just a backdrop to their story. It was a witness to their resilience, a testament to their resolve. As Captain Miller stepped out into the breaking day, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, he knew that whatever lay ahead, he and his men were ready to face it together. In the quiet of the forest, with the dawn of a new day, the first chapter of their battle at the Bulge came to a close. The stage was set, the players in place, and history waited, its pages open, ready to record the bravery, the struggles, and the sacrifices of Captain Miller and his platoon. The dawn brought little respite to the Allied soldiers in the Ardennes. The sky was a dull gray, and a biting wind swept through the camp. As Captain John Miller stepped out of his tent, his breath forming misty clouds in the cold air, the uneasy quiet of the early morning was shattered by the distant yet unmistakable sound of German artillery. The sudden bombardment sent a wave of shock through the camp. Men scrambled to their positions, their earlier calm replaced by a flurry of urgent activity. Lieutenant James Bennett rushed to Miller's side, his face a mask of concern. "They're here, Captain. The Germans are advancing." In the medical tent, Corporal Anna Kowalski braced herself for the influx of casualties that was sure to come. Her hands, steady despite the chaos, were ready to tend to the wounds of war. The forest erupted into chaos as shells exploded around them, sending shards of ice and earth into the air. Captain Miller, calm amidst the storm, issued orders with a clear, authoritative voice. "Hold your positions! Return fire!" Sergeant Elijah Harris, his face set in a grim line, directed the younger soldiers. Private Thomas O'Reilly, his previous night's dreams shattered by the harsh reality of war, loaded his rifle with trembling hands. Beside him, Private Wilhelm Schmidt fought with a fierce determination, his actions silencing any doubts about his loyalty. Radio operator Samuel Greenberg frantically relayed messages, his voice a lifeline in the cacophony of battle. Through the crackling static, the voice of Allied command was barely audible, but the message was clear: hold the line at all costs. The German forces, hidden by the dense forest, were relentless. Bullets whizzed through the trees, and the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. The Allied soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, fought desperately to maintain their ground. In a nearby foxhole, Lieutenant Bennett and a group of soldiers were pinned down by enemy fire. Bennett, despite his lack of combat experience, showed a courage that inspired his men. They exchanged fire with an unseen enemy, each shot a hope for survival. As the battle raged, Captain Miller moved between the lines, his presence a stabilizing force. He reached the position where Sergeant Harris and his group were holding off a German advance. Together, they pushed back wave after wave of enemy soldiers, but the German onslaught was unyielding. The sky, once gray, was now filled with the black smoke of burning trees and vehicles. The once serene forest had transformed into a nightmarish landscape of destruction and death. In the midst of the chaos, an explosion rocked the ground near Captain Miller. He was thrown to the side, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. As he struggled to his feet, he saw the grim reality of their situation. They were being overrun. Through the haze of battle, he locked eyes with Sergeant Harris. No words were needed. Both understood what was happening. Their position was becoming untenable. The Germans were breaking through. Captain Miller, with a heavy heart, made the decision that he had hoped to avoid. He grabbed his radio, his voice cutting through the noise. "Fall back. Regroup at secondary positions." The retreat was chaotic. Soldiers, wounded and exhausted, stumbled through the snow, helping each other as they fell back under the relentless German push. Captain Miller, though injured, maintained a semblance of order, guiding his men to the fallback position. The retreat was not without its losses. A shell exploded near Private O'Reilly, sending him sprawling into the snow, his leg badly wounded. Sergeant Harris, with the help of 2 other soldiers, quickly dragged him to safety, their actions under fire a testament to the bond they shared. Corporal Kowalski, hearing the commotion, rushed out of her tent to tend to the wounded. Her medical tent soon became a scene of desperate triage as she and her team worked tirelessly to save lives. The sound of German tanks, their engines roaring through the forest, added a new level of fear to the chaos. The Allied soldiers, now in full retreat, understood the gravity of the situation. They were not just fighting for ground, they were fighting for survival. Private Schmidt, covering the retreat, fired round after round until his ammunition ran out. He then retreated, carrying a wounded comrade on his shoulder, his face a mask of determination and fear. Radio operator Greenberg, his equipment destroyed in the bombardment, picked up a rifle and joined the defensive line. His usual place behind the radio was replaced by a more dangerous role on the front line. As they fell back to their secondary positions, the men of Captain Miller's platoon were a mix of resilience and despair. They had trained for moments like this, but the reality of warfare was harsher than any of them had imagined. The chapter closes with the Allied forces regrouping, their faces etched with the fatigue of battle. Captain Miller, despite his injuries, stood among his men, his eyes surveying the forest. The German onslaught had been fierce, and while they had survived, the real battle was just beginning. In the distance, the sounds of the German advance continued, a relentless drumbeat that promised more fighting to come. The Battle of the Bulge, with its harsh lessons and brutal realities, was far from over. For Captain Miller and his platoon, the war had taken a new turn, one that would test their courage, their resolve, and their will to survive. The relentless German advance continued to press against the Allied lines in the Ardennes. In the secondary position, Captain John Miller and his platoon, now weary and battered, braced for another wave of attacks. The cold, unyielding grip of winter seemed to echo the desperation of their situation. As the early light of dawn broke through the gray skies, Lieutenant James Bennett, with maps spread before him, reported the grim news. "Intelligence suggests we're facing a much larger force than we anticipated, Captain. They're pushing hard towards the west." Captain Miller, his face marked with the fatigue of command, acknowledged the report with a nod. He knew the stakes. The German push through the Ardennes was not just a battle. It was a desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war in their favor. Sergeant Elijah Harris, his eyes scanning the horizon, turned to Miller. "We can hold them off for a while, but if they break through—" His voice trailed off, leaving the unsaid words hanging in the cold air. Private Thomas O'Reilly, huddled in his foxhole, clutched his rifle tightly. The memories of the previous day's retreat were still fresh, the sounds of screams and gunfire echoing in his mind. Beside him, Private Wilhelm Schmidt loaded his weapon, his expression one of grim determination. Corporal Anna Kowalski, having worked through the night tending to the wounded, emerged from her tent. Her face, though weary, was set with a resolve that mirrored that of the fighting men. She moved among the soldiers, offering words of encouragement and tending to minor wounds. The morning was punctuated by sporadic gunfire, a foreboding prelude to the storm that was brewing. Captain Miller, realizing the gravity of their position, made his way to the makeshift command post where radio operator Samuel Greenberg was attempting to establish communication with headquarters. "Any word from command?" Miller asked, his voice tense. Greenberg shook his head, frustration evident in his eyes. "Nothing yet, Captain. It's as if we're cut off from the world." As the hours passed, the sounds of the German advance grew louder, the distant rumble of tanks and artillery a constant reminder of the enemy's approach. The men of the platoon waited in tense anticipation, their eyes fixed on the tree line, knowing that the next attack could come at any moment. And then it came, a massive barrage of artillery that shook the ground and tore through the forest. Trees splintered and fell, and the air was filled with the whistling of shells and the screams of men. The German infantry, supported by tanks, surged forward, their numbers overwhelming. Captain Miller, rallying his men, led a fierce defense. Bullets whizzed past and explosions rocked the ground, yet the men of the platoon fought with a courage born of desperation. In the midst of the chaos, a shell exploded near Lieutenant Bennett, sending him flying into the snow. Disoriented and wounded, he struggled to his feet, only to find himself face to face with a group of German soldiers. The battle raged on, the Allied soldiers pushed to their limits. Despite their valiant efforts, the German forces continued their relentless advance, inching closer to breaking the Allied lines. Captain Miller, amidst the cacophony of battle, realized the grim truth: they were losing ground rapidly. Sergeant Harris, leading a group of men in a counterattack, managed to push back a small pocket of German soldiers. But it was a fleeting victory. The overwhelming might of the enemy, coupled with their own dwindling ammunition and growing list of casualties, made it clear that their position was becoming untenable. In a critical moment, a message finally crackled through on Greenberg's radio. It was from Allied command, with orders that confirmed Miller's fears. They were to fall back and regroup with the main force. The Battle of the Bulge was turning against the Allies, and their current position was no longer sustainable. Captain Miller, his face etched with the strains of battle, issued the order to retreat. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of a man who knew the cost of this decision. "Pull back, men! We need to regroup," he shouted over the din of warfare. As they retreated, Private O'Reilly, helping a wounded comrade, glanced back at the chaos they were leaving behind. The battlefield, once a forest teeming with life, was now a desolate wasteland marked by the scars of war. Corporal Kowalski, her medical tent overrun, gathered her supplies and joined the retreating soldiers. Her determination to save lives remained unshaken, even as the world around her crumbled. The retreat was harrowing. Under constant enemy fire, the men navigated through the treacherous, snow-laden terrain, their every step a battle against both the enemy and the elements. As they reached the relative safety of their new position, the reality of their situation set in. They had survived, but at a great cost. The German offensive in the Ardennes was not just a battle. It was a turning point in the war, one that threatened to tip the scales in favor of the Axis powers. Captain Miller, looking at the faces of his surviving men, knew that the war was far from over. They had lost the battle, but the war was still to be won. As they prepared to join the main Allied force, Miller's resolve hardened. They would regroup, they would fight back, and they would turn the tide once more. The chapter ends with the platoon, battered but not broken, marching towards their next position, their footsteps a testament to their unyielding spirit. The Battle of the Bulge continued to rage, and in its flames, heroes were forged. The retreat to the main Allied line was a somber march for Captain John Miller and his platoon. The loss at their previous position weighed heavily on them, a stark reminder of the unpredictability and cruelty of war. The Ardennes, once a picturesque landscape, now bore the scars of battle, mirroring the physical and emotional wounds of the men who traversed it. In the new camp, the atmosphere was tense. The soldiers, huddled around small fires, spoke in hushed tones. The recent defeat had left a palpable sense of doubt and fear among the men. Lieutenant James Bennett, his arm bandaged from the injury sustained during the retreat, tried to maintain a facade of optimism. Yet, his eyes, frequently glancing over the maps and reports, betrayed his concern. Sergeant Elijah Harris, a pillar of strength for the younger soldiers, found himself struggling to uplift the spirits of his men. Private Thomas O'Reilly, who had once looked up to him with admiration and hope, now wore a look of disillusionment. The harsh realities of war had eroded the innocence and enthusiasm he once had. Private Wilhelm Schmidt, sitting apart from the others, faced silent judgment from some of his comrades. Despite his proven bravery, his German heritage stirred distrust in a time where suspicion ran high. His isolation was a reflection of the internal conflicts that can arise even among those united against a common enemy. Corporal Anna Kowalski, exhausted from the continuous care of the wounded, felt the strain of the unending demands. Her tent was always full, the cries of pain and despair a constant echo in her mind. Yet she persevered, her resolve unbroken, her hand steady as she tended to each soldier. Radio operator Samuel Greenberg, tasked with maintaining communication, faced his own battle. The static-filled radio was his window to the wider conflict, and the reports he received were disheartening. The German offensive was making significant gains, and the Allies were scrambling to mount a counteroffensive. Captain Miller, sensing the growing unease, called his officers for a meeting. In the dimly lit tent, they discussed strategies and plans, but the undercurrent of doubt was hard to ignore. Bennett voiced what many were thinking. "Are we losing this war, Captain?" Miller, his face illuminated by the flickering light of a lantern, remained composed. "This battle, maybe, but not the war, Lieutenant. We need to regroup, rethink, and hit back hard. That's how we turn this around." The meeting ended with more questions than answers, but Miller's words had a steadying effect. As the officers dispersed, the task at hand was clear. They needed to prepare for the next engagement, and it was up to them to rally the morale of their men. In the following days, the platoon worked tirelessly. They reinforced their positions, ran drills, and prepared for the inevitable next wave of German attacks. Amidst the preparations, Miller took time to speak with his men, offering words of encouragement, listening to their concerns, and reinforcing the importance of their mission. One evening, as the men gathered for a meager meal, Sergeant Harris stood up. His voice, carrying over the camp, broke the somber mood. "Listen up. We've been through hell, but we're still here, still standing, still fighting. That's what counts. We're soldiers, and we don't give up. We don't back down. We stand together, and we fight together." His speech, simple yet heartfelt, resonated with the men. For a moment, the weight of their situation seemed to lift. Faces that had been etched with worry and exhaustion now showed flickers of resolve and camaraderie. Private O'Reilly, moved by Harris's words, approached Schmidt later that night. Extending a hand in solidarity, he bridged the gap that suspicion and prejudice had created. "We're in this together," he said. Schmidt, his eyes reflecting gratitude, shook O'Reilly's hand firmly. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes in the face of adversity. Corporal Kowalski, witnessing this exchange, felt a renewed sense of hope. In the midst of war, Humanity and brotherhood could still prevail. She returned to her tent, more determined than ever to play her part in keeping these men alive. The days passed, and the platoon spirit slowly began to mend. Training exercises, maintenance routines, and the daily tasks of survival created a sense of purpose and normalcy, even in the heart of war. Captain Miller, watching his men regain their strength and resolve, knew that the real battle was as much mental as it was physical. Keeping morale high was crucial in the face of the overwhelming challenges they faced. As the chapter closes, the platoon stands together under the starlit sky, a band of brothers forged in the fires of conflict. They were not just fighting for their country, they were fighting for each other, for the values they held dear and for the hope of a peaceful future. In the distance, the rumble of artillery serves as a reminder of the looming battle. But for now, in their unity, they find strength. The tide of war may turn, but the resolve of these men remains unbroken, their spirits undimmed. They were ready for whatever the next day would bring, united in their purpose, steadfast in their courage. The night sky over the Ardennes was a canvas of stars, a stark contrast to the turmoil on the ground. Captain John Miller stood outside his tent, his breath visible in the cold air, contemplating their next move. The intelligence reports were not promising. The German forces were closing in, and the Allied lines were being pushed back further each day. In the early hours of the morning, the dreaded order came through. Radio operator Samuel Greenberg, his face grim, handed the message to Miller. The platoon was to retreat to a more defensible position closer to the Allied headquarters. It was a strategic move, but for the men, it felt like another setback. As day broke, the platoon began the arduous task of retreating under the threat of enemy advancement. They moved quickly, dismantling their camp with practiced efficiency. Every man knew the importance of speed. The German forces were not far behind. Lieutenant James Bennett, coordinating the retreat with Miller, looked over the maps. "We'll need to move through the valley. It's our quickest route," he said, pointing to a narrow pass marked on the map. Sergeant Elijah Harris organized the men into groups, assigning roles and responsibilities. "Stay sharp, stay together," he instructed, his voice steady despite the underlying tension. Private Thomas O'Reilly, his previous encounter with near death still fresh in his memory, packed his gear with a newfound sense of urgency. He glanced at Private Wilhelm Schmidt, who gave a nod of understanding. The silent exchange spoke of their shared determination to survive. Corporal Anna Kowalski, her medical supplies packed, prepared to move the wounded. Her tent had been a refuge for many, and now she faced the challenge of transporting her patients under precarious conditions. The retreat began with Miller leading the way. The platoon moved swiftly but cautiously, aware that the enemy could be upon them at any moment. The dense forest provided cover, but it also obscured their view, adding to the anxiety of the unknown. As they navigated through the valley, the sound of distant artillery grew louder. The Germans were advancing, and time was running out. The terrain was challenging, with icy paths and hidden obstacles, but the men pressed on, their survival instincts in full gear. Halfway through the valley, disaster struck. German artillery fire found its mark, exploding among the platoon. Chaos ensued as men scattered for cover. Amidst the smoke and confusion, Miller tried to rally his troops. Sergeant Harris, near the front, quickly organized a defensive position, returning fire to provide cover for the others. O'Reilly, caught in the blast, was thrown to the ground, dazed but unharmed. He scrambled to his feet, helping a fellow soldier who wasn't as lucky. Corporal Kowalski, her medical team in tow, rushed to the wounded, administering first aid amidst the chaos. Her calm demeanor under fire was a beacon of hope for the injured. Radio operator Greenberg, his equipment damaged, frantically tried to establish communication with no avail. Cut off from command, the platoon relied solely on Miller's leadership. The German attack intensified, and Miller realized they couldn't hold their position. "We need to move, now!" he shouted, signaling the men to continue their retreat. They moved, carrying their wounded, their progress slow but unyielding. As they neared the end of the valley, the sounds of battle began to fade. They had made it through the most dangerous part of their journey, but they were not out of danger yet. The weariness of the men was palpable, each step forward a testament to their resilience and determination. In a clearing, Miller called for a brief halt. He assessed the situation, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of the enemy. The platoon, spread out in a defensive formation, took the opportunity to catch their breath. The faces of the men were drawn and tired, but there was a sense of relief that they had survived the valley. Lieutenant Bennett, checking the map, conferred with Miller. "We're not far from the rendezvous point. If we can make it there, we can join up with the main force." The prospect of reuniting with the larger Allied army brought a flicker of hope to the men. They knew that their survival depended on reaching that point. With renewed purpose, they set out once more, navigating through the dense forest. As they marched, the bond between the soldiers grew stronger. They had faced adversity together and had come out alive. This shared experience forged a brotherhood that went beyond the uniform they wore. Private Schmidt, who had proven his loyalty time and again, was now fully accepted by his comrades. The earlier mistrust had given way to mutual respect, born out of the shared trials of war. Corporal Kowalski, despite her exhaustion, continued to tend to the wounded. Her dedication was a source of inspiration for the men, a reminder of the humanity that persisted even in the darkest of times. As they approached the rendezvous point, the sound of Allied artillery became audible, a sign that they were close to safety. The men quickened their pace, driven by the thought of reaching the safety of the main force. Finally, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, the platoon arrived at the rendezvous point. They were greeted by the sight of Allied soldiers, a welcome change from the constant threat of the enemy. Captain Miller, his face showing the toll of the retreat, debriefed the commanding officer. The platoon was weary, but they had completed their mission. They had survived the retreat, and now they were part of a larger force, ready to regroup and fight back. As the chapter closes, the men of the platoon set up camp among their fellow soldiers. They were safe for the moment, but the war was far from over. They knew that the days ahead would bring new challenges, but they were ready to face them together, as a unit, as comrades in arms. The battle was lost, but their spirit remained unbroken, their will to fight undiminished. In the aftermath of the grueling retreat, Captain John Miller's platoon found themselves amidst the larger contingent of Allied forces, a tapestry of exhausted yet determined men. The makeshift camp buzzed with activity as soldiers set about reinforcing defenses and preparing for the inevitable German assault. The platoon, once isolated in the Ardennes, now found solace in the camaraderie of their fellow soldiers. Stories of bravery and loss were shared around campfires, each tale a thread in the larger narrative of the war. Lieutenant James Bennett, his arm in a sling, joined Captain Miller at a briefing with senior officers. The map laid out before them was a jigsaw of Allied and German positions. The discussions were intense, focused on strategies to counter the German offensive. Despite the setback, the mood among the commanders was resolute. This war was far from over, and they were determined to turn the tide. In the medical tent, Corporal Anna Kowalski worked tirelessly. Her area was overrun with casualties from the recent engagements. Despite the grim circumstances, her presence brought a sense of calm to the wounded. Her hands, though weary, were steady and gentle as she moved from cot to cot. Private Thomas O'Reilly, helping with the fortifications, found a new sense of purpose. The retreat had been harrowing, but it had also been a crucible, tempering his resolve. He worked alongside Private Wilhelm Schmidt, their friendship having solidified in the fires of conflict. The barriers that once stood between them had crumbled, replaced by a mutual respect forged in battle. Sergeant Elijah Harris, now a veteran of many battles, took it upon himself to mentor the younger soldiers. His wisdom, often laced with humor, was a balm to the anxious and the weary. He knew that morale was as crucial as ammunition in this fight. Radio operator Samuel Greenberg, his equipment restored, maintained constant communication with Allied command. The information he relayed was vital, providing updates on enemy movements and Allied strategies. His role was often overlooked, but he was the lifeline that connected the platoon to the broader war effort. As preparations continued, Captain Miller took a moment to reflect. The loss at their previous position weighed heavily on him. Every decision, every order he gave, carried the lives of his men. The burden of command was a solitary one, but he bore it with a quiet dignity. The days passed, and the camp became a fortress. The Allied forces, bolstered by reinforcements, were ready to face the German onslaught. The air was tense with anticipation. The soldiers knew that the next battle would be crucial in determining the course of the war. Then, one clear morning, the silence was broken by the distant rumble of German tanks. The enemy was advancing, and the battle for which they had been preparing was upon them. Captain Miller, standing before his men, addressed them with a calm authority. "This is it, men. We hold the line here. We fight not just for ourselves, but for our brothers in arms, for our families back home, for freedom. We stand together, and we will prevail." The men listened, their faces a mix of fear and determination. They were no longer just soldiers. They were defenders of a cause much greater than themselves. The German attack came like a tidal wave, a relentless push of men and machines. But the Allies were ready. They met the enemy with a ferocious defense. Artillery roared, rifles cracked, and the air was filled with the cacophony of battle. The ground shook under the barrage of shells, and the sky was streaked with the trails of tracer bullets. In the thick of the fight, Captain Miller and his platoon stood firm. Lieutenant Bennett, despite his injury, commanded a section of the line with unwavering focus. His leadership, under such dire circumstances, was inspiring. Sergeant Harris, in the midst of the chaos, was a force to be reckoned with. He moved along the line, offering encouragement, directing fire, and rallying the men. His presence bolstered the resolve of those around him. Private O'Reilly and Private Schmidt fought side by side, their rifles a steady rhythm in the orchestra of war. They had become more than just fellow soldiers. They were brothers in arms, each covering the other's back. Corporal Kowalski, her medical tent once again a refugee for the wounded, worked alongside her team with tireless dedication. The wounded came in waves, and she met each one with the same level of care and compassion, her resolve unshaken even in the face of overwhelming odds. Radio operator Greenberg, amidst the noise and chaos, kept the lines of communication open. His voice was a steady stream of updates and requests, coordinating support and relaying crucial information. As the battle raged, the Allied line held. The German forces, met with such fierce resistance, began to falter. Their advance slowed, then stalled, and finally, they began to retreat. Captain Miller, watching the enemy withdraw, felt a surge of relief mixed with exhaustion. The victory was hard won, and the cost was high. The ground before him was a testament to the brutality of war, a landscape scarred and littered with the remnants of the battle. In the aftermath, the platoon regrouped. They were weary, battered, but unbroken. The victory had been a turning point, a critical blow to the German offensive. The men of the platoon had played their part, and they had done so with courage and determination. As the chapter closes, the soldiers gather around their campfires once more. The mood is somber, reflective. They mourn their losses, tend to their wounds, and share their stories. But there is also a sense of pride, a recognition of what they had achieved together. Captain Miller, looking at his men, felt a profound sense of gratitude and responsibility. They had faced unimaginable challenges and had emerged stronger. The war was far from over, but this moment, this victory, was a beacon of hope in the darkness of conflict. They would move forward, together, ready to face whatever the war would bring next. The bonds they had formed were unbreakable, and their resolve was unyielding. They were soldiers, comrades in arms, united in their quest for peace and freedom. The aftermath of the battle brought a rare moment of tranquility to the war-torn Ardennes. The snow, a pristine blanket over the scars of combat, reflected the somber mood of Captain John Miller and his platoon. They had triumphed, but the victory was bittersweet, marred by the loss of comrades and the harsh realities of war. In the quiet of the winter morning, the men were given a chance to rest and reflect. The camp, a hive of activity just days before, was now subdued. Soldiers tended to their gear, wrote letters home, or simply sat in silent contemplation. Lieutenant James Bennett, his arm healing, spent his time poring over maps and reports. The recent victory had shifted the tide, but the war was far from over. There were strategies to plan and movements to anticipate. Yet, in the stillness of the forest, he found a moment to reflect on his journey. From the inexperienced officer who first arrived in Europe to the battle-hardened leader he had become. Sergeant Elijah Harris, seated near a smoldering fire, shared stories with the younger soldiers. Each tale, a blend of humor and wisdom, served not just to entertain but to impart lessons learned from years of combat. His anecdotes were a bridge between the daunting uncertainty of war and the enduring spirit of the men who fought it. Private Thomas O'Reilly, who had seen the depths of war's horrors and its fleeting triumphs, found solace in writing. His letters home were a cathartic expression of his experiences, a way to make sense of the chaos that had become his reality. Private Wilhelm Schmidt, once an outsider, now fully integrated into the fabric of the platoon, helped with the maintenance of their equipment. The task was mundane, yet it brought a sense of normalcy, a reminder of life beyond the battlefield. Corporal Anna Kowalski, taking a rare moment for herself, sat apart, her medical kit by her side. She looked out at the snow-covered forest, its beauty a stark contrast to the memories of the wounded and fallen she had tended to. In the quiet, she allowed herself to feel the grief, the pride, the fatigue, all the emotions she had kept at bay in the service of others. Radio operator Samuel Greenberg, his equipment now silent, joined a group of soldiers sharing a meager meal. The camaraderie around the fire was a small but vital reprieve from the isolation that often accompanied his role. Captain Miller, walking through the camp, observed his men. He saw not just soldiers but individuals, each with their own stories, fears, and hopes. The weight of his responsibility towards them was a constant presence, but so was his unwavering commitment to their well-being. As the day waned, Miller found himself at a vantage point overlooking the valley. The setting sun cast long shadows on the snow, painting the landscape in hues of orange and purple. It was a moment of peace amidst the relentless march of war. Here, in the quiet solitude, Miller allowed himself to reflect. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges. They had faced the worst of humanity, yet also witnessed profound acts of courage and sacrifice. The war had taken much from them, but it had also given them an unbreakable bond, a brotherhood forged in the fires of conflict. As the darkness of night began to envelop the forest, Miller returned to the camp. The men were settling in, finding comfort in the routines of camp life. The flicker of the fires cast a warm glow on their faces, a brief respite from the coldness of the world outside. In the communal spirit of the camp, stories continued to be shared. Laughter, a rare and precious sound, punctuated the night air, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. These moments, fleeting as they were, provided a much-needed counterbalance to the rigors of war. Private O'Reilly, looking up from his letter, watched his comrades. He saw in them a reflection of himself, changed by war, yet clinging to the essence of who they were before the world had turned upside down. Private Schmidt joined a group of soldiers in a game of cards. The banter, light and teasing, was a language of normalcy, a way to temporarily escape the omnipresent shadow of conflict. Corporal Kowalski, having finished her rounds, sat quietly with Sergeant Harris. Their conversation, a mix of reflections and aspirations, was a bridge between the past and a hopeful future. As the night deepened, Captain Miller, seated by a fire, joined his men. The barrier of rank seemed to dissolve in the shared warmth of the flames. They talked, not as soldiers and commander, but as individuals, each with their own fears and dreams. In these moments of connection, the war seemed a distant echo. They were reminded of the world beyond the battlefield, of the reasons they fought, and of the hopes they held for a peaceful future. As the fire dwindled, the men retired to their tents. The silence of the night was a blanket under which they sought rest, both physical and mental. In the quiet, each man faced his own thoughts, his own memories, and his own hopes for the days to come. The chapter closes with the camp asleep, the soldiers resting in the temporary peace afforded to them. The war would continue, but for now, they found solace in the stillness of the night, in the shared experience of survival, and in the strength they drew from one another. In the reflections in the snow, they saw not just the hardships they had endured, but also the enduring bonds they had formed, the strength they had discovered within themselves, and the unwavering hope that guided them through the darkest of times. As the winter thawed into spring, the Battle of the Bulge faded into the annals of history, but its legacy endured in the hearts and minds of those who fought it. Captain John Miller and his platoon, their bonds forged in the crucible of conflict, carried forward the lessons and memories of that pivotal moment in the war. The Battle of the Bulge stood as a testament to the resilience and courage of the Allied forces in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a turning point where the tide of war shifted, leading eventually to the defeat of the Axis powers and the end of World War II. For Captain Miller and his men, the battle was more than a military engagement. It was a journey of personal growth, sacrifice, and camaraderie. They returned home as heroes, but the scars of war remained, a silent reminder of the price they had paid for freedom. The stories of their bravery and resilience were passed down through generations, a tribute to the spirit of those who fought not just for victory, but for the values they held dear. The Battle of the Bulge, in its horror and heroism, became a symbol of the enduring human spirit, a chapter in history that would never be forgotten. As time marched on, the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes grew anew, but the echoes of the past lingered in the whispering trees. They stood as silent witnesses to the courage and sacrifice of Captain Miller and his platoon, guardians of the legacy of the Bulge.